For a while, I'd noticed something was different about my wife, Emily. We'd been married for almost 6 years, and while we didn't have what I'd call a perfect marriage, things were usually good. We'd been through a lot together, and we always seemed to pull through. But over the last few months, she had started acting differently. It was subtle at first, the way she would be gone when I got home from work or the way she'd brush off my questions with a casual, "It's just work," whenever she had to leave unexpectedly. But it kept happening, and the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I couldn't help but notice the strange patterns emerging. She'd be out late, sometimes even leaving after dinner, claiming to have last-minute meetings. And the excuses were always different. One week, it was that her company was pushing her harder than usual. Another week, it was some vague, business dinner. Every answer was so carefully given that I felt like I was losing my mind wondering if I was just being paranoid. Then one day, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was heading to work early one morning and realized I'd forgotten my laptop at home. I drove back, only to notice Emily's car in the driveway. Curious, I walked over to her car, thinking I might find something simple that would ease my mind. But what I found was an empty bottle of champagne lying under the back seat, hidden, but not well enough. The real shock came when I noticed something on the leather, unmistakable traces of semen. It was like a punch to the gut. I froze, my stomach turning with a mix of dread and fury. I didn't confront her then. No, I wasn't ready to play all my cards just yet. Instead, I decided to catch her in the act, to make sure there were no doubts, no lies she could hide behind. That's when the idea struck me, a GPS tracker. I knew a guy from work, Nate, who had a buddy that could hook me up with one. Nate and I worked in the logistics department of a big shipping company, so tracking devices weren't exactly uncommon around us. Nate didn't ask too many questions when I told him what I needed, and within a day, I had the tracker ready to go. That night, I waited until Emily had fallen asleep before sneaking into the garage and placing the tracker under her car. It was small, discreet, and she would never notice. I knew that with this tracker, I'd finally know the truth. I'd see where she was going, who she was meeting, and finally put my mind to rest. The first few days didn't reveal much. I monitored her movements on my phone app like a hawk, watching every street name and turn. She drove to her office, the grocery store, even to her mom's house. But I knew something was off. Emily wasn't stupid, she would be careful about meeting up with someone. She'd make sure it was at an odd time, a time when she thought I wouldn't be paying attention. Finally, after almost a week of watching, something happened. That night, I told her I had to work a late shift, which wasn't unusual in my line of work. I left, but I didn't go far. I waited nearby in my car, hidden in the shadows, watching as the house lights dimmed. Midnight passed, and then, just after 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification: Emily's car had started moving. My heart pounded as I watched her tracker on the map. I didn't even need to zoom in, I knew exactly where she was headed. She drove straight to her ex-boyfriend's place. At that moment, everything in me snapped. The hours of doubt, the agony of suspicion, and the stomach-churning humiliation all came crashing down on me like a tidal wave. This wasn't some random fling or one-time thing. She had been lying to my face, betraying me, making a fool out of me. And now, it was time for me to take control. I wasn't thinking straight, but I didn't care. I decided to head over there myself and confront them both. As I drove, a million thoughts ran through my mind, each one angrier than the last. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my neck, and the boxer in me itched to let loose. I hadn't fought competitively in years, but I still trained, kept myself in shape. My muscles tightened as I gripped the wheel, ready for whatever might come. When I finally reached her ex's place, I parked a few houses down, taking a few deep breaths before stepping out of the car. I moved quietly, slipping around to the side window. The lights were on inside, and through the sheer curtains, I saw enough to confirm everything. Emily was there, with him. It didn't take a genius to figure out what they were doing. That was it. I didn't even knock. I barged right in, the door crashing open as I strode in, my fists clenched. I barely even looked at her, my eyes locked onto him. It was like an automatic switch went off, and before I knew it, my fist connected with his face. Everything around me faded away, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, the rush of blood pounding in my ears. In the chaos that followed, I made sure to capture everything on video. Every brutal second of it. I didn't care who saw it. I wanted the world to know exactly what she'd done, what kind of person she really was. After that night, I knew there was no going back. I'd crossed a line, but so had she. All those months of feeling like something was wrong, every gut instinct I'd ignored, every excuse she'd given, it all added up, and I wanted everyone to see her for who she really was. That's when the real plan began to take shape. I knew I needed more than just that one video. I wanted everything, proof, text messages, places she'd been, everything she thought she'd hidden. So I started digging. I had already installed the GPS tracker, which logged every location she visited, but I needed more. I wanted details, and I knew where to find them. Her phone was the goldmine. It wasn't difficult for me to access it, I knew Emily's passcode. She thought I was clueless, but in reality, she had left me everything I needed. While she was in the shower, I went through her messages and took screenshots of every suspicious text, every late-night call log, and every photo that hinted at something more. There were messages to Mike, her ex, going back for months. From their conversations, it was clear that she'd been lying to me about everything. I went through her photos, and the anger started building up again. Photos of her with him, candid shots of them together in places she'd never mentioned to me, and selfies she'd sent him in the middle of the night. Each image felt like a dagger in my chest, twisting and turning with every discovery. I took my time, collecting each piece of evidence, making sure I missed nothing. By the time I was done, I had every piece of the puzzle. But it wasn't just for me, I wanted her family to see it too. They deserved to know who she really was, how she betrayed not just me, but the trust we'd all built together. Her parents had always been supportive of us, and we were close. They treated me like their own son. I couldn't imagine them siding with her once they saw what she had done. The next step was to put everything in place. I had the video from her ex's house, the GPS logs, the screenshots from her phone, and every other incriminating detail I could find. I organized it all into a file, one that would leave no room for doubt. I wasn't going to confront her directly, not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own actions when she least expected it. A few days later, I told her I'd be working overnight again, but this time, I wasn't going to be anywhere near work. I watched her leave the house as usual, and like clockwork, she went to her ex's place again. This time, I didn't go after her. Instead, I headed to her parents' house. I knew they'd be awake, and I had a feeling they'd listen to me before jumping to conclusions. When I arrived, her father, Richard, was the one who answered the door. He looked surprised to see me, especially so late, but he welcomed me in. Her mother, Linda, was sitting in the living room, watching TV. They both looked at me with concern as I took a seat across from them. I hadn't given them any explanation yet, and I could see the worry in their eyes. "Is everything okay?" Richard asked, his face wrinkling with concern. "You don't look well, son." I took a deep breath, holding back the anger that had been simmering for days. "I wanted to talk to you both," I said slowly, my voice barely hiding the tension I felt. "There's something you need to see." Without another word, I pulled out my phone and opened the file. I showed them the photos, the screenshots, the GPS logs, and finally, the video. They watched in stunned silence, Linda covering her mouth with her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. Richard's face turned red, his jaw clenching as he watched his daughter betray everything they had raised her to be. I didn't need to explain anything, the evidence spoke for itself. Every lie, every betrayal, was there for them to see. When the video finished, Linda was openly crying, her face a mix of shock and heartbreak. Richard sat there, his expression hardened into a mask of barely restrained anger. I could see he was trying to keep his composure, but the veins on his neck bulged, and his fists were clenched tight. This wasn't just my betrayal, this was theirs too. They'd welcomed me into their family, trusted their daughter to have made the right choice, and yet here we were. Linda finally spoke, her voice trembling. How long has this been going on? From what I gathered, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, it's been at least a few months, maybe longer. She's been meeting up with him regularly, even while lying to me about work or family obligations. I paused, swallowing the bitterness in my throat. And the worst part? She didn't even try to hide it well. She thought I'd never find out. Richard shook his head slowly, disbelief written across his face. I don't understand. We didn't raise her this way. He looked up at me, guilt pooling in his eyes. I'm so sorry, son. You didn't deserve this. I didn't say anything for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. I wanted to rage, to shout, to let them know just how deeply I'd been hurt. But they were hurting too. I could see it in the way Linda wiped at her tears, the way Richard's shoulders slumped. This was a betrayal on every level. I'm going to confront her, I finally said, my voice cold and determined. But I wanted you both to know the truth first. You've been like family to me, and you deserve to understand what's been happening. I'm going to make sure she faces the consequences. Linda looked up at me, her eyes filled with pain. Please, whatever you need, we're here for you. I don't know what's wrong with her, but you didn't deserve this. I nodded, appreciating their support even as my heart ached. This wasn't going to be easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I was done playing the fool. After saying my goodbyes to her parents, I drove back home and waited. Emily had no idea what was coming, she probably thought I was still at work. I sat in the dark living room, replaying everything in my mind, steeling myself for the confrontation. Finally, around 3 a.m., I heard the hum of her car as it pulled into the driveway. She entered the house quietly, tiptoeing as if afraid to wake me. The audacity of it all made my blood boil. She was sneaking in, expecting me to be none the wiser, completely oblivious to what I had discovered. I waited until she was in the kitchen, hanging up her coat, before I switched on the light. She jumped, her face blanching when she saw me sitting there, watching her. For a split second, guilt flashed in her eyes, but she quickly masked it, putting on a casual smile. "Oh, you're up," she said, forcing a lightness into her voice. "I thought you were working late." I stayed silent, just staring at her. She shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, the unease slowly creeping into her expression. "What's wrong?" "You tell me," I replied coldly, my voice a razor's edge. Emily's eyes darted to the side, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she searched for an excuse, a lie to worm her way out. I don't know what you mean." "Really?" I scoffed, pulling out my phone and holding it up. I watched as her face drained of color, her eyes widening as she realized what I was about to show her. "I've been tracking you, Emily. Every night. I know where you've been, who you've been with. I have it all here." She took a shaky step back, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes filled with panic. "Please. I can explain." "Explain." I laughed bitterly, unable to contain the rage simmering under the surface. "Explain how you've been lying to my face for months. How you've been running off to your ex like I wouldn't find out. Save it, Emily. I don't want to hear another one of your lies." Her face crumpled as she realized there was no way out. She started to cry, but her tears did nothing to soften my anger. I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I don't know what I was thinking. Spare me the excuses. I stood up, towering over her, watching as she shrank back. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our trust, you threw it all away like it meant nothing. Emily fell silent, looking down at the floor as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. Her tears were too little, too late. I watched as she struggled to find words, her hands trembling. I could see the panic building in her eyes, the sudden realization that she wasn't in control anymore. But her tears, her apologies, all of it felt hollow. You thought I'd never find out, didn't you? I continued, my voice icy. You thought you could sneak around, make a fool out of me, and just come home as if nothing happened. Were you ever going to tell me the truth? She shook her head slowly, unable to meet my gaze. I was confused, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Confused? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You were confused every time you met him. Every lie you told me was just confusion. Emily's head dropped lower, her face hidden by her hands. She had no defense left, no words that could make any of this right. I could feel my heart pounding, the adrenaline coursing through me, and I knew this was the moment to put an end to it. You're going to pack your things and leave tonight, I said coldly, watching as her head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. This marriage is over. I'm done. Her lips parted, her voice shaky. Please, we can work this out. I know I made a mistake, but I love you, and we can get through this. Love? I scoffed, crossing my arms. You don't get to use that word. You threw away everything we built. This isn't a mistake, Emily. This is betrayal. Her expression crumbled as she realized I wasn't going to back down. Where will I go? She whispered, her voice breaking. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to cheat, I replied, unmoved by her desperation. You can go to your parents. They know everything, by the way. I showed them all the evidence. They know what kind of person you are now. Emily gasped, her face turning pale as my words sank in. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, but they didn't move me. She'd taken everything from me, destroyed the trust and love we'd built, and now she was left with nothing. That was her choice, and she would have to live with the consequences. I turned away, my voice final. Take what you need and leave. I'll handle the divorce. Emily's sobs filled the silence as she scrambled to pack a bag. She was a mess, and for once, I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. She deserved this, every tear, every ounce of shame. This was the reality she'd created. I heard her footsteps as she left the house, and when the door closed behind her, I finally felt the weight lift off my shoulders. There was pain, a deep ache where the love we once had used to be, but beneath it all, there was relief. I was free from the lies, from the betrayal. The next day, I filed for divorce. Understood. Here's the continuation of the story, expanded to meet the required detail and length. The room felt like it was closing in, suffocating us with the weight of everything unsaid over the months she'd been lying. I stayed quiet, arms crossed, letting her sit in the silence, hoping it would force her to acknowledge the gravity of her actions. She tried to speak, her lips parting with stuttering attempts, but I could see the fear that kept choking her words. You thought I'd never find out, didn't you? I finally said, my tone steady, holding back the full wave of anger. I wasn't going to let her twist this moment. You thought I'd just sit here, totally blind while you snuck around behind my back. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. It wasn't like that, she mumbled, the shame evident in her eyes. I mean, I didn't. I don't know what I was thinking. That's right, you don't know. You never thought about anyone but yourself, I replied, the bitterness in my voice almost surprising me. I'd never spoken to her like this, and it made the situation painfully real. And don't pretend this was some accident. I have the texts, the videos. I know this has been going on for months. Please, just let me explain, she whispered, and I almost laughed at the audacity of it. I leaned back, giving her that one chance, even though every word she spoke felt like another lie. Explain. Go on then. I gestured, watching her carefully. Explain to me how driving to your ex's house in the middle of the night and sneaking back in at 3 a.m. counts as something that just happened. She took a deep breath, a faint spark of defiance in her expression. I was confused, she said, voice shaking. It's not like I ever wanted this to happen. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe seeing him again would. I don't know, bring closure to things. I scoffed. Closure. I repeated, not bothering to hide my disdain. You thought sleeping with him, lying to my face, sneaking around, that was going to bring you closure? Her face fell, and I saw the tiny cracks in her confidence beginning to split. She shook her head, wringing her hands, her expression one of panic as if she'd only just realized how deep the hole she'd dug was. It's not that simple, she tried, but her words felt hollow. I was just trying to understand what I was missing. I needed to see if I'd made the right choice. Wow. I almost laughed. So this is about you needing reassurance. I didn't realize I was just some backup plan, in case you got bored. You know, that's pretty ironic, considering the way you promised me loyalty on our wedding day. The memory of that day flooded my mind, the image of her in her wedding dress, vowing to stand by me, through thick and thin. The contrast between that moment and now felt almost absurd. She had shattered every single promise without a second thought, and for what? A fling with an ex she claimed to have moved on from years ago. Emily's shoulders slumped, her eyes red with tears, and she looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I don't know what else to say, she murmured. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was the apology I'd thought I wanted, but hearing it felt empty. There was no real regret in her voice, only guilt because she'd been caught. You're sorry, I said, letting the words hang in the air. That's great. So what are you sorry for, exactly? For cheating on me? For lying about it? Or just for getting caught? Emily's silence was answer enough. Listen, I continued, my voice sharp, you're going to pack your things and leave tonight. I'm done. This marriage is over. She looked up at me, shocked, like she hadn't expected me to go this far. Her mouth opened and closed, as if she was searching for some excuse, some way to escape the consequences she'd brought upon herself. Where will I go? She whispered, a trace of desperation in her tone. Please, I have nowhere to go. You have somewhere, I replied, my voice cold and unyielding. You can go to your parents. They know everything. I showed them the videos, the texts, all of it. They know who you are now. Her eyes widened in horror, and I saw the reality crash down on her. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with fresh tears, but it was too late for that. She'd burned every bridge, and now she was left with nothing but ashes. Please, she began, her voice breaking. I know I messed up, but, can't we try to fix this? I love you. I really do. I couldn't hold back the bitter laugh that escaped me. Love? You don't get to use that word. You threw away everything we built together. This wasn't a mistake, Emily. This was betrayal. Her face crumpled as she tried to speak, but no words came. I didn't care about her apologies anymore. I'd spent months holding on, believing in a lie, but now I was free. This was the end, and I wasn't about to let her guilt keep me chained to a broken promise. I stood up, my voice final. Take what you need and leave. I'll handle the divorce. Emily stood there, frozen for a moment, then stumbled into the bedroom, grabbing a bag and throwing her clothes inside haphazardly. She was a mess, her hair disheveled, her face pale with shock. I stayed in the living room, listening as she packed, unmoved by the sounds of her sobs. Eventually, I heard her footsteps as she walked down the hall. She looked at me one last time, her face streaked with tears, but I didn't return her gaze. I was done. With one last, shaky breath, she walked out the door, leaving the house we'd shared for years. As the door clicked shut, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The pain was still there, a dull ache where love had once been, but underneath it was a growing calm. I was free from the lies, from the betrayal, and I wasn't about to look back. That night was only the beginning. There were more hurdles ahead, the legal battles, the emotional fallout, but I had set my course, and nothing would stop me. The next morning, I went down to the courthouse to file for divorce. Emily's betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I had given her my love, my trust, and she had crushed it underfoot. Now it was time to rebuild, to start a life free from the deception she had laced through every part of our marriage. As I left the courthouse, a new determination filled me. Emily had tried to steal my dignity, my peace, but she hadn't won. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that this time, I wouldn't be standing in the shadows of lies. The days that followed Emily's departure felt surreal, like I was walking through the empty shell of a life that no longer felt like mine. Every room in the house held memories, echoes of laughter and conversations that were now tainted by her betrayal. I knew moving on would be a challenge, but I couldn't let the weight of her choices hold me back. After filing for divorce, I began the task of reclaiming my life piece by piece. I cleared out her things, donated some to charity, threw away the rest. In a way, it was therapeutic. Each item removed felt like shedding an old layer, like discarding remnants of the person who had hurt me. I wasn't just cleaning out my house, I was making room for a fresh start. The quiet days felt lonely at first, but I was determined not to sink into bitterness. I threw myself into my work, picking up extra projects to fill the hours. Colleagues like Jake and Hannah, who had always been friendly but never pried, noticed the change and began inviting me out for drinks after work. Jake was a solid guy, a no-nonsense family man with a contagious laugh. Hannah, meanwhile, was sharp and quick-witted, the kind of person who could lighten the mood with just one well-timed joke. Their companionship became my refuge, a place where I could escape my thoughts and enjoy a few laughs. One evening, after a long day, we gathered at a cozy little bar near the office. Jake and Hannah were deep in conversation about some work issue when they noticed me sitting quietly, lost in thought. "Hey, you're not zoning out on us, are you?" Jake nudged me with a grin. "Sorry, just, a lot on my mind," I replied, forcing a smile. Hannah raised her glass, eyes twinkling. "To new beginnings," she said, giving me a knowing look. "Sometimes life throws us a curveball, and the only thing to do is swing back harder." The comment struck a chord. These people didn't know the details of what I'd been through, but somehow they understood. They didn't push for details, and I appreciated that more than I could say. I raised my glass in return, feeling a spark of hope that had been absent since the day I discovered Emily's infidelity. As the weeks passed, I started filling my life with activities I'd neglected. I joined a local boxing gym, rekindling my passion for the sport that had once been my outlet. The intense workouts brought clarity, pushing my limits and leaving me too tired to dwell on the past. The trainer, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Roy, noticed my dedication and gave me pointers after each session, helping me refine my technique. Boxing became my therapy, a place where I could channel my anger constructively, punch after punch. One Saturday morning, as I was getting ready to leave the gym, I ran into Roy in the parking lot. He was older, with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, but there was a warmth in his eyes that softened his tough exterior. "Hey, kid," he called out, waving me over. "You've been working hard. What's driving you?" I hesitated, not wanting to spill the whole story, but something about his presence felt safe. "Just, getting through some personal stuff," I said, shrugging. He nodded, understanding without prying. You know, boxing's not just about strength, he said. It's about resilience. You've got to take the hits, keep standing, and never let your guard down. His words resonated with me. I wasn't just fighting in the ring, I was fighting to rebuild my life, to regain control after everything had been shattered. As the weeks turned into months, I gradually rebuilt myself. My routine had structure again, my mind was clearer, and the wounds Emily had inflicted felt less raw. I found solace in the support of friends like Jake and Hannah, and in the discipline of boxing. I wasn't over what had happened, but I was moving forward, one step at a time. One evening, after another successful workout, I received a text from Emily's father, Robert. He was a quiet man, reserved, and had always shown me respect. But the tone of his message was strained, almost pleading. "Can we meet? I need to talk to you." "It's about Emily," the text read. Curious and wary, I agreed. We met at a small coffee shop, a neutral ground where we could talk without judgment or accusations. Robert looked tired, the lines on his face more pronounced, as if he'd aged years since our last encounter. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I wanted to apologize." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Apologize? For what?" He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly around his coffee cup. "For everything that happened. For the pain my daughter caused you. You didn't deserve any of it." I looked at him, feeling a mixture of emotions. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell him how his daughter had destroyed my trust, but his sorrow was genuine, and it took the edge off my anger. "It wasn't your fault, Robert," I said quietly. "Emily made her own choices. I'm just trying to move on." He nodded, clearly relieved that I wasn't lashing out. "I don't know where I went wrong with her. She had everything, a husband who loved her, a stable life, and she just threw it all away. I never understood it." There was a long silence, the weight of our shared sadness filling the space between us. Robert looked up, his eyes filled with a father's anguish. "I know this might not mean much, but I wish things had turned out differently. I'm sorry." His apology felt sincere, and despite everything, I found myself softening. I'd harbored so much anger since the day I discovered Emily's betrayal, but sitting here with Robert, I realized I didn't want to carry that burden anymore. It was time to let go, to truly move forward without the bitterness that had threatened to consume me. "Thank you, Robert," I said, offering him a small smile. "I appreciate it. I really do." We parted ways with a sense of closure, an unspoken understanding that both of us were victims of Emily's choices in different ways. The encounter left me feeling unexpectedly lighter, as if a part of the past had finally been laid to rest. The next day, I walked into the gym with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting to survive anymore, I was fighting to thrive, to reclaim the life I deserved. With every punch, every drop of sweat, I felt myself growing stronger, more resilient. The scars Emily left were still there, but they no longer defined me. This was my time to rebuild, to rise from the ashes she'd left behind, and I wasn't going to waste another second looking back. The future was mine, and I was ready to face it, one step at a time, with a determination that could never be shaken. As my journey to rebuild my life continued, unexpected changes began taking place. With Emily out of the picture, I found myself reconnecting with people and making new friends, embracing a social life I had long neglected. Jake and Hannah became more than just colleagues, they turned into close confidants. I trusted them, and in their company, I started to regain a sense of normalcy. After another grueling workout session one evening, I lingered in the gym longer than usual, chatting with Roy, my boxing trainer. He had taken on a kind of mentor role in my life, someone who saw beyond the surface and understood the inner battles I was facing. That night, he offered me a suggestion that would change my routine, and perhaps even more. "Ever thought of training young kids?" Roy asked, studying me carefully. We could use a strong role model like you around here. A lot of these kids are dealing with tough stuff, and they'd benefit from a steady hand." At first, I hesitated. I had my own struggles to handle. Was I ready to mentor someone else? But the thought of helping others gave me purpose. The following week, I began training with a group of local kids. They were a mixed bunch, some shy, some scrappy, all eager to prove themselves. As I worked with them, I saw pieces of myself reflected in their eyes, the need for discipline, the hunger for resilience. One of the kids, Caleb, was especially fiery. A 16-year-old with a troubled past, he'd come to the gym seeking an escape from the challenges at home. There was a spark in Caleb that reminded me of myself at his age, and I began investing more time in him. Slowly, he opened up, and our training sessions became a place where he could talk freely, unloading his frustrations while building his strength. One evening, as Caleb and I wrapped up, he looked at me with something like awe. "How did you get through everything, Coach?" he asked, his voice low. I paused, surprised by the depth of his question. "By learning to take one hit at a time," I replied, "and by surrounding myself with people who lift me up. It's not easy, but it's possible." My life was changing, evolving into something I hadn't anticipated. Even though Emily's betrayal was still a painful memory, it no longer consumed my every thought. I was finding new meaning in the relationships I was building, with Jake, Hannah, Roy, and now, the kids at the gym. It felt as if I was slowly piecing together a version of myself that was stronger, wiser, and more grounded. Then one evening, a message popped up on my phone that caught me off guard. It was from Emily. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk. Please. Just one chance." I stared at the screen, a rush of anger and bitterness surfacing. After everything, she had the nerve to reach out. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the faint curiosity tugging at me. What could she possibly have to say after all this time? Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We arranged to meet at a neutral cafe, and when I arrived, I saw her sitting at a corner table, looking almost unrecognizable. She seemed worn, her once radiant smile replaced with an expression of sadness and regret. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down, folding my arms as I regarded her coolly. "What do you want, Emily?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her coffee cup. I know I messed up. I lost everything. And it's my fault. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry." Her apology landed softly, without much effect. I had heard those words from her before, empty promises that had meant nothing. But this time, there was something raw in her voice, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. "It's too late for apologies, Emily," I replied, my tone firm. "You made your choices. I'm moving on." She looked down, a tear escaping as she tried to keep herself composed. "I know. I thought I was happier without you, but I was wrong. I hurt you, and I've lost everything. I needed you to know." A part of me felt satisfaction at seeing her remorse, but another part simply felt empty. I had spent months picking up the pieces of my life, building something new and better. I didn't need her regret to validate my choices. With a deep breath, I stood up. "I don't need an apology, Emily. I needed you to be someone you weren't. That's over now." I walked away, leaving her in the cafe with her tears and regrets. There was no satisfaction in that moment, only a profound sense of closure. I had taken the final step in letting go, releasing the remnants of the pain she had caused. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange sense of peace. Emily's chapter in my life was finally closed. I no longer needed answers or apologies. I had created a life of my own, a path that I could walk without her shadow hanging over me. The next day, I returned to the gym with renewed energy. Caleb greeted me with a grin, and we fell into our training rhythm with a shared focus. I could see the growth in him, the way he was starting to believe in himself. It felt like a reflection of my own journey, of finding strength in unexpected places. Over time, I found myself in a new chapter filled with people who brought positivity into my life, who reminded me of the importance of resilience and self-worth. My interactions with Jake, Hannah, Roy, and the kids at the gym became the pillars of my new world, each one reminding me that I was stronger than the betrayal that had once nearly broken me. I had transformed, forged by hardship into a version of myself that was no longer haunted by the past. Emily's betrayal had been painful, but it had also set me on a path to rediscovery, to a life where I could finally be at peace with who I was and who I was becoming. As I looked ahead, I knew there would still be challenges, still moments of doubt. But I also knew that I had the strength to face whatever came next. I had learned to stand on my own, to create a life that was truly mine, and that was a victory no one could ever take away. With Emily now firmly in the rearview mirror, I leaned fully into my newfound independence, my days filling with purposeful activity. Every morning, I'd hit the gym before work, channeling my emotions into boxing routines that sharpened both body and mind. I could feel myself growing, not just physically but emotionally, too. The pain of betrayal was no longer a dull ache but a memory that I could look back on as a turning point in my life. My friendships with Jake and Hannah deepened, they became more than just friends, they were my support system. After work, we'd often unwind at a local bar or restaurant, discussing everything from work to life plans. Jake, as always, was the pragmatic one, helping me keep grounded. Hannah, however, had a more adventurous spirit. She constantly nudged me to try new things, reminding me that life was still full of possibilities, even after heartache. One Friday night, as we sat around a dimly lit table at our favorite spot, Hannah threw out an idea. "You know, you should take a vacation, something far from here. Get a change of scenery," she suggested, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "A vacation?" I laughed, swirling my glass. "Feels a bit random, don't you think?" Hannah shook her head, her tone insistent. "No, it's not random. You've spent so much time here, so much time on healing. But sometimes you need a different kind of break, you know. Somewhere that doesn't remind you of everything." She was right, of course. I'd been going through the motions of rebuilding my life but hadn't yet taken any real time away to rediscover myself, free from reminders of what had happened. The idea began to grow on me, and soon, Jake and Hannah helped me plan a trip to the West Coast. I decided on San Diego. The beaches, the culture, the laid-back lifestyle, it was everything my life had been missing. The moment I stepped off the plane, I felt the difference. The air was lighter, the ocean nearby, and there was a freedom in knowing I was somewhere new, where no one knew my past. It felt like a fresh page. The first few days, I explored the city, the vibrant Gaslamp Quarter, the sprawling Balboa Park, and of course, the beach. I found myself walking for hours along the shoreline, letting the waves wash over my feet as I tried to let go of the last remnants of bitterness that still lingered. I met new people, too, locals and travelers alike. There was a couple from Colorado, a surfer from Australia, and a retired teacher who taught me a thing or two about the best spots to eat. One night, while sitting on the beach watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something profound. Emily's betrayal hadn't only taken away my trust in her, it had challenged my trust in myself, in my judgment, in my ability to pick up the pieces and find happiness again. But as I sat there, in a place far from the pain, I knew that I had changed. I was no longer the same man who had been blindsided by her actions. I was stronger, more resilient. I spent the next week soaking in everything San Diego had to offer, allowing the city to become a part of my healing process. When I finally returned home, I was renewed, as though I'd shed an invisible weight. Jake and Hannah noticed the change right away. "You look different," Jake remarked as we settled back into our usual routine. "Like you finally let it all go." In some ways, he was right. I felt lighter, more open to the future. I'd rebuilt myself piece by piece, forging a new identity that didn't rely on my past. Then, about a month after my return, something unexpected happened. I was at the gym, leading one of my training sessions with Caleb and the other kids, when a young woman approached. She was a bit shy, but there was a spark of confidence in her eyes that caught my attention. "Hi, sorry to bother you," she said, smiling nervously. "I'm Amber. I just moved to town, and Roy told me you're the best trainer around here." We started talking, and before I knew it, she was part of our training group. Amber was different from anyone I'd met. She had a sharp wit, a fierce determination, and a kindness that resonated with me. Over time, I found myself looking forward to our conversations, to the way she'd laugh at my sarcastic comments or offer a word of encouragement to Caleb and the other kids. One evening, after training, she asked me to grab a coffee with her. It was casual, easy, and natural in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. We shared stories about our lives, our ambitions, and the things we'd overcome. I told her a bit about my past, though I left out most of the painful details, focusing instead on the things I'd learned. Amber had her own share of struggles. She'd moved to start fresh after her own painful breakup, and she was as committed to her new beginning as I was to mine. We found common ground in our resilience, our refusal to let past hurt define our future. After Emily's unexpected apology, I thought I'd found closure. But life has a funny way of showing us that endings aren't always as neat as we'd like. A week passed, then another, and just as I was fully settling back into my new routine, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from, Frank, my old college roommate. Frank had been my closest friend for years, though we'd lost touch after college as our lives went in different directions. He'd become a corporate lawyer in Boston, working long hours and living the high-paced city life. When I heard his familiar voice on the line, I was surprised, to say the least. "Hey, man," he greeted, his voice tinged with concern. "I heard through the grapevine about what happened, with Emily. Figured it was about time I checked in." I sighed, taking a moment to collect my thoughts. "Yeah, it's been a rough year, Frank. How did you find out?" Frank let out a nervous laugh. "Emily's ex, Kyle, remember him? He works with one of my buddies, and apparently, she's been hitting him up too." He started talking about some messy affair, and when I heard the names, I connected the dots. Kyle. My gut twisted at the mention of him. I'd already known she had gone back to him, but hearing his name again brought a rush of resentment. Frank, sensing the shift in my tone, quickly changed the subject. "Listen, why don't you come up to Boston for a few days? Clear your head. It'll be like old times." The invitation came at the right moment. I agreed, hoping that time away would help further ease the leftover bitterness still lingering in my mind. When I arrived in Boston, Frank was waiting for me at the airport, all smiles and back slaps, eager to catch up. He'd barely aged a day, his confidence and energy infectious. We spent the first night revisiting old college haunts, drinking beer, and sharing memories. It felt good to laugh again, to be around someone who had known me long before the mess with Emily began. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Frank introduced me to his circle of friends, successful professionals who were both impressive and intimidating. One of them, Mark, was an entrepreneur who'd made a name for himself with a tech startup. Another, Lila, was a consultant for international firms, always on the go, with a sharp mind and quick wit that kept us all entertained. One evening, as we sat around Frank's apartment with his friends, the conversation turned to relationships. It was Lila who asked the question I hadn't anticipated. "So, I heard you're coming out of a divorce. Any advice for the rest of us?" Her tone was light, but I could see genuine curiosity in her eyes. Caught off guard, I hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess, just don't ignore the red flags. When you see them, address them. And never lose sight of yourself." Lila nodded thoughtfully. "Easier said than done, right?" Over the next few days, I felt something shift in me. Being around Frank and his friends, people who had their own share of life's ups and downs, reminded me that I wasn't alone in facing challenges. Everyone has their own baggage, their own story of heartbreak or struggle. It was both humbling and liberating. On my last night in Boston, Frank and I found ourselves on his balcony, overlooking the city lights. He handed me a glass of whiskey, his expression more serious than usual. "Look, man," he began, "you've been through hell, but I can see you're coming out stronger. Just don't let this define you, okay?" I nodded, appreciating his words more than he knew. "Thanks, Frank. For everything. You don't know how much this means to me." He clinked his glass against mine. "Anytime, brother." When I returned home, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. Emily's betrayal was no longer a weight on my shoulders. Instead, it felt like a chapter I'd finally finished reading, one that I didn't need to revisit. Back home after my brief respite in Boston, I found myself in a new state of mind. The quiet loneliness that had once felt suffocating was now more like an old friend, something I could acknowledge without feeling burdened by it. There was an odd sense of peace in knowing that I had faced my demons, and while the scars were still there, they no longer controlled me. I was back into my routine. The gym sessions, which had once been a way to channel my frustration and anger, became a sanctuary for my thoughts. The punching bag didn't just absorb my hits anymore, it helped me think, helped me process. I was able to clear my mind by focusing solely on the present, the rhythm of the punches, the sound of my breath, the beat of my heart. This newfound discipline in my physical life slowly began to seep into other parts of my world. It was as though my body and mind had started operating on a different wavelength, more aligned than ever before. One evening, after a particularly exhausting training session, I was cooling down by the side of the gym when a familiar voice interrupted my solitude. It was Hannah, one of the trainers at the gym, someone I'd met a few months ago. She was always upbeat, constantly encouraging the kids she trained and often offering advice on how to push through mental blocks. "You've been hitting that bag like it owes you money," she said with a grin. "You doing okay?" I chuckled, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Better than I was, I guess. It's been a journey." She sat down next to me, her expression turning more serious. "You know, I've seen a lot of people go through the same kind of thing. The betrayal, the heartbreak. It changes people. But you're stronger now. You're not letting it define you anymore." Her words stuck with me. It was true, I wasn't allowing the pain from my past to control my actions anymore. I wasn't letting it define who I was, what I could be, and where I was going. Hannah continued, "Sometimes, the best way to heal is to find something new to focus on. Something that brings you joy. Have you thought about taking that vacation again? Or even just trying something different here? You've been stuck in this loop for a while." Her suggestion lingered with me long after I left the gym. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was still trapped in a mental loop, one that kept me going through the motions but not fully living. Emily's betrayal had clouded my every move for so long that I hadn't realized how much it still affected me. It wasn't just the divorce, it was the way I let the negativity consume me. But I was ready to change that. The next morning, I woke up with a new resolve. I grabbed my phone and booked a weekend getaway to a small mountain retreat. It wasn't a grand vacation, but it was enough to disconnect from the daily grind. I needed a space to rediscover myself and, more importantly, to focus on what truly mattered, my own well-being. The drive to the mountains was peaceful, filled with the quiet hum of the road and the occasional burst of nature's beauty as I passed through small towns and winding highways. By the time I reached the cabin, I felt like a different person. The crisp mountain air seemed to strip away the remnants of the life I had known in the city, leaving me feeling lighter, free. I spent the weekend hiking through trails, fishing in the nearby lake, and enjoying the solitude. There was something about the simplicity of it all that grounded me, something that made the noise of everyday life fade into the background. For the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace. But it wasn't just the environment that was helping me heal, it was the realization that I didn't need to constantly prove myself, didn't need to keep seeking validation from others. For so long, I had tried to fill the emptiness with anger, frustration, and, at times, self-pity. But out here, in the stillness, I found that I could exist without all that. I could be enough, just as I was. When I returned home, I felt renewed. The clarity I had gained in the mountains seemed to follow me back into my daily life. My work at the gym, my interactions with friends, even my thoughts about Emily, everything felt different. I had moved on. Not just from the betrayal, but from the life I had lived while I was with her. I wasn't the same person, and that was okay. In fact, it was more than okay, it was freeing. One evening, just a few days after my return, I was at the gym finishing up a training session when I received an unexpected message. It was from Emily. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, and the sudden ping of my phone caught me off guard. "Can we talk? I think we need to clear the air." I stared at the message, the words hitting me like a wave. Part of me wanted to respond, to ask her why she'd come to me now after everything. But I had no desire to engage in the emotional mess anymore. I wasn't the person who needed closure from her anymore, I had found that within myself. I deleted the message, the old weight of her betrayal now a distant memory. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. I was free, truly free. There was no more unfinished business. After that final interaction with Emily, I thought I was truly done with her. I had cut the emotional ties that had bound me to her for so long, but life has a strange way of throwing unexpected challenges in your path when you least expect it. In the days that followed, I felt the remnants of the past trying to seep into my present, like old shadows that just couldn't seem to fade away. But they didn't have the power they once did. I had learned something over the past few months that I hadn't fully understood before: closure doesn't come from the other person. It comes from within. A week after deleting Emily's message, I was sitting at the local coffee shop, sipping my usual black coffee, when I saw someone that made my heart skip a beat. It was Sarah, my old friend from high school. I hadn't seen her in years, not since graduation. Back then, we'd been close, but life pulled us in different directions. She was one of the people I'd always trusted, someone who knew me inside and out before any of the chaos that came later. She had that rare quality of being both grounded and spontaneous, serious when needed but always ready to share a laugh. I watched her walk into the coffee shop, looking just as I remembered her, only more polished and confident. She caught sight of me almost immediately and smiled, walking over with a warm greeting. "Ben, you're still the same, just older," she said with a grin, her voice carrying the same friendly tone it had back in high school. "Sarah. Wow, it's been ages. How've you been?" I replied, surprised but glad to see her. We sat down at a small corner table and immediately fell into conversation. The years apart seemed to vanish, and it was as if we had just picked up where we left off. We caught up on everything: her job in marketing, her travel adventures, and my disastrous marriage and divorce. She listened intently as I shared my experiences, never judging, only offering genuine concern and support. After a while, our conversation turned to deeper topics, as it often did with old friends. "So, Ben, how are you really doing? I mean, beyond the gym and keeping busy," she asked, her gaze soft but probing. I thought about it for a moment, unsure of how to answer. I had gotten used to being self-reliant, keeping everything inside, but Sarah had always been the one person who could make me open up. "I'm better," I said finally. "I'm not as angry as I was. I think I'm actually starting to rebuild, but I don't know where to start. It's been a rough ride, and there's a lot I'm still sorting through." She smiled, her eyes kind. "You've been through hell, Ben. But I think that's part of it, right? Rebuilding doesn't happen overnight. You're doing the right thing by giving yourself time. Just don't forget to live, too." Her words hit home more than I realized. For so long, I had been living in the aftermath of Emily's betrayal, unable to see past the pain to the life that was still ahead of me. But now, with Sarah's encouragement, I felt like I could breathe again. There was a future, a world outside of the past I had lived in. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I spent more time together. We went on hikes, grabbed dinner, and talked about everything and nothing. She had a way of making the mundane feel significant, and slowly, I began to realize just how much I had been missing out on by living in the past. I found myself thinking about her more and more. It wasn't romantic at first, I just appreciated her presence in my life again. But the more we spent time together, the more I found myself drawn to her. It was subtle at first, the way she made me laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about something she was passionate about. But it grew into something deeper. I hadn't realized it, but I was healing in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, after a long walk through the park, we sat on a bench and watched the sunset. It was one of those perfect moments where time seemed to stand still. We were quiet for a while, each of us lost in our thoughts. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Ben," she began, her voice tentative, "I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear right now, but I think you're ready for something new." I turned to look at her, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" She smiled softly. "I know you've been hurt. And I know you're not looking for anything serious right now. But I see you, Ben. I see the person you are under all of this. And I think there's a chance for something real between us, if you want it." Her words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. My first instinct was to pull away, to retreat into the safety of my own isolation. But as I looked at her, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was time to stop running from the possibility of happiness. Maybe it was time to open myself up again. "I think I'd like that," I said quietly, the words carrying more weight than I had expected. Her smile grew wider, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope for the future. Maybe it was possible to love again. Maybe I didn't have to carry the scars of the past forever. As we sat there, the evening sun casting long shadows across the park, I realized that it wasn't just the end of my relationship with Emily that marked a new chapter in my life. It was the beginning of something new, not just with Sarah, but with myself. The past no longer defined me. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was ready to move forward. Life was starting to make sense again. And for once, I wasn't afraid of what came next. As the weeks passed, I slowly but surely began to embrace the new reality I had found myself in. Sarah and I continued to spend time together, and I noticed subtle changes in myself. The anger and bitterness that had once consumed me were gradually replaced by a sense of calm and purpose. It was clear that I was no longer the man I had been during my marriage to Emily, and in many ways, that was a good thing. I had learned the hard way what I could tolerate and what I couldn't, and more importantly, I had rediscovered who I was. Life with Sarah was different from anything I had expected. It wasn't just the laughter and easy companionship that made our time together enjoyable, it was also the quiet understanding we shared. She knew the weight I carried from my past without me having to say a word, and she respected the space I needed. But she was also there when I needed someone to talk to lean on. She didn't try to fix me, she just allowed me to be. One evening, as we sat in a cozy restaurant near the river, enjoying a quiet dinner, she looked at me with that familiar glint in her eye, the same one that had caught my attention years ago. "Ben, you've come a long way," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "I can see the change in you. You're not carrying the past anymore. You're not holding on to the hurt." I smiled, grateful for her insight. "I think that's what it's all about, right? Letting go. Moving on. It's not easy, but it's necessary." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's hard to see sometimes, especially when you're so wrapped up in the pain. But I think you've finally given yourself permission to heal. And that's something I admire. We continued talking, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for everything that had brought me to this point. Yes, the betrayal had been brutal. Yes, the divorce had torn me apart in ways I couldn't have imagined. But in the end, it had led me here, to this moment, with Sarah, and to the realization that I wasn't just a victim of my circumstances. I was someone capable of rebuilding, of finding happiness again. The next few months were filled with new experiences. Sarah and I took spontaneous trips, explored parts of the city we'd never seen before, and simply enjoyed each other's company. But as much as I valued my time with her, I knew that the most important part of my healing was still the journey I was on with myself. I continued my boxing training, pushing myself harder each day. I no longer saw the gym as a place to work out my anger. Instead, it became a space where I could focus solely on my own growth, both mentally and physically. My mind was clearer than it had ever been, and my body was stronger, more capable. I wasn't just repairing my heart and mind, I was rebuilding my entire life from the ground up. And then, one evening, as I was finishing up a particularly tough workout, I received a message that made me pause. It was from Emily. Her name appeared on my phone like a shadow, a reminder of a chapter one thought I had closed forever. But this time, I didn't feel the rush of anger or resentment. I didn't feel the need to retaliate or question her. I just felt nothing. The message was simple. I've been thinking about you. Can we talk? I stared at the screen, trying to process my emotions. A year ago, I would have panicked. A year ago, I would have replayed every moment with her, wondering what it meant. But now, I simply felt indifference. I had done the work. I had moved on. I wasn't the man I had been when I'd first discovered her betrayal. I was no longer tied to her, or to my past. I deleted the message without responding. It wasn't because I was angry. It wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I had already let go. There was no more unfinished business. No more loose ends. The next day, I sat down with Sarah at the park, the same bench where we had shared so many quiet moments. We talked about everything and nothing, but mostly about the future we were starting to build together. It felt right, this sense of moving forward with someone who understood me, who cared for me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I'm glad we're doing this, I said to Sarah, my voice steady. Me too, she replied, her hand gently squeezing mine. You've been through so much, Ben. And I'm proud of you for letting go, for moving forward. You deserve to be happy. Her words settled over me like a warm blanket. I wasn't the man I had been in the past. The betrayal, the heartache, the confusion, all of it had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I had learned from it. I had moved beyond it. As we sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that my life was finally starting to take shape again. I had faced the hardest part of my journey, and while the scars would always be there, they no longer dictated my path. The future was wide open, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to walk forward into it with a sense of hope and anticipation. I wasn't defined by Emily's betrayal. I wasn't defined by the pain of the past. I was defined by the choices I made now, by the strength to let go, to heal, and to embrace the love and possibilities that still lay ahead. And with that, I knew my journey was far from over. It was just beginning.